Hi, I'm Sasan Kasravi with Proteus Debate Academy. It's Thank You for Your Patience Thursday. This is going to be a little bit of a long video. It's on asking effective questions. Here is a table of contents, and we're going to add one in the description with timestamps so you can click on, jump around if you want to, not watch the whole thing or come back to a specific part. All right, some context. Most debaters don't have a clear goal in their question asking. And people who want to improve at cross-ex, generally the first thing I do with them is I ask them what they're trying to accomplish, and they don't really have a clear answer. And that's really bad because strategy inherently means having goals. Cross-ex, another noteworthy thing about it, is it's the only time in the debate where there really should be direct dialogue between the debaters. In the main speeches, the debater should be addressing the judge, not the opponent. And so there's that aspect of it, but also it's the only time in the debate where there's like a back and forth, really, between the debaters. And winning cross-ex typically means winning the round for largely that reason. So here's some general advice on cross-ex that you can just put in your back pocket. You're likely struggling with cross-ex because your cases are bad and you're unprepared. In other words, this video isn't going to take you from being bad at cross-ex to being great at cross-ex. It's going to take you from being decent at cross-ex to being good at cross-ex. Cross-ex just isn't going to save a bad debate. The reason your questions are probably weak or you don't know what to ask is because you don't have a solid enough grasp on your own case, or you just haven't researched the topic well enough to know about the case that your opponent just ran and what its weaknesses are and what you should be saying. Another piece of general advice is, this comes from like legal, like lawyer, like law school, law stuff, which is don't ask questions you don't know the answer to, right? When you're looking at a trial, I mean, this happens in the movies all the time, but in actual legal cases, lawyers don't ask questions they don't know the answer to. In other words, they don't ask questions for inquiry reasons. They're asking the questions to get a witness to say in their own words what the person asking the questions wants the jury to hear. And most judges pay more attention to cross-ex than anything else. This is because judges, especially lay judges, but really all judges, largely make their decision based on who just seems like they're winning the debate, and cross-ex is a great time to make direct comparisons between the two debaters or the two sides because they are having a direct dialogue, and that makes it really easy to get an impression of who's sort of controlling the round. Last piece of advice is not to ask yes or no questions. Ask open-ended questions where you can help it. This is sometimes okay, and those instances are instances in which it's furthering a goal or a strategy that we're about to talk about. Now, here's a piece of advice that if this is the only thing you remember, if you only remember one thing from this video, I hope it's this. Cross-ex is not refutation. This is the most common mistake I see debaters make, even sort of well into more experienced debaters. And it's just really important to keep in mind the only thing that refutes one of your opponent's arguments are counter-arguments or your refutations. You asking the opponent if they're wrong is never going to work because they're not going to come up and say, "You're right, I am wrong." What instead they're going to, well, we'll talk about that in a second, but the only thing that's going to disprove their arguments is your own evidence and logic to show why it's bad or whatever. And you should be setting up for that, which is a large portion of this video. What happens when you ask someone if they're wrong is first it signals to your opponent what your strategy is going to be. And what happens after that is you tell them what you think the weaknesses in their speech are, and you allow them to start making front lines to everything and answering your next speech before you have a chance to even make it, and expanding on their impacts before you get a chance to outweigh it. Just don't do it. Okay, so what are the strategic goals of cross-examination according to the Proteus Debate Academy, being myself, Paul Villa? Well, We're going to go in order of least important to most important, which is also how we're going to be talking about it through the video. Least important, but still a goal, is get clarification. After that is control time, set up your arguments, and make your opponent look bad. So let's get into that. The first is clarification questions. And clarification questions just ask your opponent to explain something that you didn't understand. And this is, where a lot of people starting in debate start out with their questions trying to accomplish. And it's almost never a good thing because it lets your opponent control time, which we're about to talk about, but it also allows the judge to better understand and hear more about their case, which doesn't help you if you're trying to tell them it's not important or not true. And it also frames you as not being in control of the conversation. It makes it, especially if the judge did understand the thing you're asking about, it makes it seem like you're not smart enough to follow, or you don't know enough about this topic, or you're just not a strong enough debater to keep track of the arguments. Now, with that having been said, do it if you need to, right? It's still on the list. It's not a forbidden thing to do. Just sort of know that, if you have to ask questions to understand what's happening, you're already sort of behind in the debate in most instances. So now let's talk about controlling time. Answering questions almost never benefits you because when you think about it strategically, the questions your opponent is asking is, at least in their mind, getting you to say something that is benefiting them. But beyond that, just from a time standpoint, in a format like parliamentary debate, having to answer questions comes out of your constructive speeches. Now, college parley, or at least NPDA, has added flex time so that it doesn't come out of your speech, but still you can ask questions during constructive, and I'm pretty sure in high school parley it's still a trade-off between answering someone's question and getting to make your own actual arguments, which you don't want to take a lot of time doing, but if you're the person asking the questions, yeah, absolutely, you want to make people have to answer your questions. I was in a debate once where I was the negative, and it had something to do with mental health, and this was kind of a jerk move, but I could tell that this was something that my opponent was really passionate about as an issue, so I raised my hand in her first speech, and I asked her, to what degree are mental illnesses similar or different to physiological illnesses? And she had a lot to say about it, and she spoke for maybe 3 minutes about it, and it had nothing to do with any of the arguments that I was going to make. She ended up getting through almost none of her case because of it, and I just got up and I was like, yeah, I totally agree with that, great analysis, and I just gave my arguments. Kind of a dick move. But in a format like public forum, which I think a lot of the people watching this do, you share the cross-examination time, right? So having to answer someone's question takes time away from you asking them questions. So if you're asking a question, that's what you want, right? You want them to take away from the time they have to ask you questions. So it does control time, and that's a relatively important thing. Now, in public forum, I'd say it's less important than in something like parley because they literally don't get to make constructive arguments. But in general, time is the most important commodity in debate, and any advantage you can gain in time is always going to benefit you. Now I put a little splash page for setting up your arguments because this section really could have been its own video. I just thought the video would make sense being a sort of all-inclusive thing. But let's talk about setting up your arguments. The first way you set up your arguments is you get links. And that's pretty much what most people think of when they think of setting up your arguments. Sometimes it's difficult to convince someone that your argument is relevant to the topic. Now, if it's something like a format with plans, that would just be straight up whether or not your argument links into some action that the other side takes. But sometimes if it's like a high school Lincoln Douglas or a high school public forum type event, it might be unclear whether your opponent is going to defend the type of action that you're about to criticize. So you might ask a question about that, right? You ask your opponent, like, do you advocate for this? And one example of that, right, for the LD topic that was treating the illegal use of drugs as whatever, is on the affirmative, I would ask the question, like, does your advocacy free people who are currently in prison for nonviolent drug offenses? Or like stop them from being able to go to prison. And if they say no, I know I'm going to be able to say the argument that I have for, why keeping these people in prison is bad. Now, there's, of course, the option of them saying yes, so it's good to have a strategy for if they say yes and if they say no. All right. The rest of what I'm talking about when I say setting up for your argument requires us to touch on the premise model of argumentation, which some of you will be very familiar with. Some of you, this is your introduction, and that's great. It's a very fundamental concept in philosophy, which you would learn in any intro to philosophy class. So, the premise model of argumentation divides arguments into two sections, premises and conclusions, and I'll touch on this just briefly. A premise is a statement that you attempt to prove the validity of. The validity of something is whether or not, like, evidence in the real world supports it. So that's evidence or existing beliefs, right? So if you can just try to argue, you already believe this, here's how this is that. That would all be what a premise attempts to accomplish. What a conclusion does is a statement that combines premises that you've laid out to draw a statement that is sound. So what sound means is that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So you're not really, maybe you don't have direct evidence for the conclusion even, which is often the case in debate. We don't tend to have topics where there's direct and conclusive evidence for one side. So you usually have to combine evidence to draw these conclusions, but so sometimes you don't have direct evidence for it, but regardless, it becomes more foolproof, right? It puts the burden on your opponent to disprove your premises, and if they can't, the conclusion has to be true. Now, there's a lot more to be said on this, and even just better explanations that are more in depth, use better visuals, I don't know, whatever, for free all over the place. Go ahead and look into that if you're interested in that, but I think that's a good enough base point to start with. Okay, so here's what 3 examples of that would look like. So here's an example of 2 premises that lead to a conclusion if they're true. This is like the original, it's called syllogism, but it's all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, this argument was first made after Socrates died, so it wasn't all that outlandish, but you can see, like, all men are mortal is a statement that a lot of people take at face value, but in theory, you would need evidence to support that if we're going to, really take it seriously. Socrates probably didn't exist as far as our evidence shows. But if the first premise and the second premise are true, the conclusion follows necessarily, right? There's no real scenario in which you can argue that all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, and yet Socrates is not mortal. You have to disprove one of those premises. The second example is what is largely called a logic puzzle, which some people like, I like, but some people are annoyed because it feels like tests that you get sometimes, which is Amy owns a Honda or a Kia. Amy does not own a Honda, therefore Amy owns a Kia. And this is the easiest logic puzzle of all time, but it demonstrates the point, right? Now, Amy probably doesn't exist. I don't know who the hell Amy is, but for the sake of like this conclusion, if those premises are true, the argument is sound, and therefore we have to believe that Amy owns a Kia because there's no other logical conclusions. And in fact, logic, the word, doesn't mean being smart. It refers to this system of premises and conclusions and other like almost mathematical interactions between arguments. Now the third one is just one premise, and it's Ben is a bachelor. The conclusion is therefore Ben is not married. And this argument could be true and it could even be sound, but what it has is it has what we call an implicit premise, which is something that the argument doesn't state, but it like implies, or it's not stated, but the arguer holds it to be true, or at least is assuming. And that is that bachelors are by definition not married, right? So if you have this, it becomes a proper multi-premise leading to a conclusion argument, but there's an implicit premise. But here's the thing with implicit premises. One, they're really useful when you are fishing for links, because if you can identify what your opponent hasn't said but must believe in order for their argument to be true, and you can disprove one of those things, one, congratulations, you're a great critical thinker and I'm proud of you. Remember me when you make it to the top. But secondly, it makes it so that they have fewer front lines, they're less ready for it. And the cool thing is that this guy over here basically demonstrated that almost every argument has an almost endless amount of implicit premises in it, or in other words, assumptions. Everything you state assumes a lot of things, and if you can criticize those things in a debate, then that is great. Sometimes that can get annoying. I mean, at the end of the day, it's up to whatever convinces your judge, right? I don't think most judges would be convinced by just a response that's like, what if we're in the Matrix? But I don't know if you want to make a K about it or something. Great. So now let's really get into how to use this, how to apply it, how to set up our arguments using these premises. Well, your arguments each have several premises that you need to prove. And we already know that in a debate, concessions are very difficult to take back. Now, usually when we talk about concessions, that means like cold concessions, or in other words, someone not refuting something, meaning they agree. But in this case, we're going to basically make people actively agree with something. And what happens then is when both people actively agree with something in a debate, it usually is held to be true by the judge. And it's really hard for a debater to take back something they said earlier. It's much more difficult than trying to argue why your drop shouldn't count as you conceding something. So let's start applying this. Let's say there's a resolution, we should all drive electric cars, and we're going to negate this resolution. Well, what will our negative contentions be? In this case, the first one is electric cars are too expensive. Contention 2, electric cars won't slow down climate change. That's a defensive argument, and we'll come to how you can tell later. And contention 3, EV batteries, electric vehicle batteries, harm the environment. Okay, here's some bad questions that you might ask attempting to set up for these arguments, which is usually how I see people, at least beginners, try to set up for their arguments. They'll say something like, aren't electric cars too expensive for everyone to buy? And like we mentioned earlier, all you're doing is letting your opponent know what you're going to argue and giving them a platform to start saying, no, they're not too expensive, and here's why. Similarly, isn't it true that it's too late to stop global warming? Like, you've just given away your whole response, and now they'll be like, no, or even if it was, here's why this argument's still important. Here's a slightly different example. Can you explain how electric vehicles improve the environment? All you're doing is letting them come up and strengthen their links and talk about why their impacts are great. And now you have more to argue against if you're going to try to say that that impact isn't very important. Here's another one. Do you know how bad making EV batteries is for the environment? This is the worst one. This is the worst example we have here, because then they will say, like, even if it's bad, here is why that argument, blah, 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 blah. Now you're fighting an uphill battle for what should have been a gotcha argument. So now let's talk about where we go from here to find good questions, and that is we start with analyzing what the premises of our arguments are. And usually this is actually kind of easy because hopefully if you're writing arguments well, even if you're not using the advantage model, you have subpoints within your contentions where you've recognized there's certain premises. Even if you didn't know the word premise, there's certain things you have to prove in order to reach your conclusion. So let's look at contention 1. What are the premises here? The first premise is that electric cars cost more than most people can afford, which you would probably try to prove with evidence. The second premise is making people buy cars they can't afford would be bad, or the government paying for it all, or whatever the case may be. Whatever you are saying needs to happen, that would be bad. And the conclusion that this necessarily leads to is that we should not all drive electric cars. And that's a great conclusion because the conclusion is vote neg, right? If the judge believes we should not all drive electric cars, that's how they vote negative. So the conclusion for all of your arguments should be vote negative as a result of this. Let's look at the second one. You'll notice that this has a different conclusion. And let's start at the premises first, though. That's climate change needs X to be stopped. Now, X here stands for whatever criteria you're saying. You find evidence that says, here's what it takes to have any sort of impact on this, reversing it or slowing it down. And the second premise would be, here's what they advocate for and what it does, and here's why that amount, that whatever amount they accomplish is less than what is necessary to actually make an improvement. So the conclusion here is preventing climate change is not a valid reason for everyone to drive electric cars. And as you can see from that, that is defensive, right? That's not a reason to vote for the affirmative. That's just, this argument really should be a block. I included it because I see arguments like this all the time, and I thought this might be a useful time to talk about it, but we'll have a separate short video on the difference between defense and offense. Let's look at contention 3, and here the premises are that making electric vehicle batteries does serious environmental damage. The second premise is for everyone to drive electric vehicles, millions more need to be made. And the third is the status quo is preferable to that, is preferable to us making millions more. Now, the hardest part of this to prove is that your opponent is saying that we should make millions of more cars because in all likeliness, they haven't come up and said in their own words that that's what they advocate for. But in any case, if you can prove all three of those premises, the conclusion is, again, the conclusion we like, we should not all drive electric cars. So let's take a look at some good questions. And when I list these, you're going to see the question and the answer I anticipate. Because as we talked about earlier, you should be asking questions with an answer you want in mind. How do you answer these questions well? You answer it with something that I haven't written down as an answer I anticipate. You disrupt the strategy that I'm trying to set up. But let's throw out a question, and then we'll look at which of our premises the answer might prove. Here's the first question. It's okay. It's not a great one. It's not the best one, but it's fair. Do you own an electric car? So here they have two options for how they answer, right? Yes or no. And we want a strategy for either way, right? So they say, let's say they say no. You say, why not? And then they'll say probably something along the lines of they're expensive, or something that you can spin to mean they're expensive. Now let's say they say yes, cool. You say how much did it cost? And they tell you some amount, and then you spin that to sound expensive. Well, as a result of this, you've gotten them to say that electric cars are expensive, which is the first premise of contention 1. What that means is now when you bring up contention 1, you mention my opponent has already said that this is the case. So my opponent agrees here. So all I need to prove is premise 2, that making people buy these cards when they're so expensive is a bad thing, right? So it cuts down the rhetorical work you have to do on this argument by half, which is a really useful tool. Let's look at another question. How much carbon do you estimate this would take out of the air? Now, they might say, I don't know, or they might give you a figure, right? But they have really no way of anticipating what you're gonna do with that answer. And even if they sort of anticipate it, they have no way easily of convincingly preventing it, because they've now proven the second premise, right? They've given Y a value that is set in stone. Unless they say, I don't know, in which case you could say, they don't even know, blah, blah, blah. But say they give Y a value, all you need to prove is the premise 1, which is what the value of X is. So remember that X is what we need to see a change. And if they say Y, all you have to prove is that X is true, X is the actual amount, and then the fact that X is greater than Y just becomes apparent. You don't need to prove anything, really. You just say that it's not enough. Whereas if you hadn't asked that question, you hadn't gotten a strict figure, and you had made this argument, they would have come up and tried to spin it as, no, like this is enough to affect the change you want, because they would have had an easier pathway to doing that than them having to give the number up front and you using it against them. Let's look at another one. This is a pretty good one. Are there enough electric cars in the world right now for everyone to drive one? Now, here's why this is good. This is good because well, for one thing, it's a yes or no question, which we said not to do, but it's good because what it does is it signals a certain strategy. But the strategy that it most likely signals to most people is that you're going to make a no solvency argument, right? Because frankly, if they said no, it would be really bad for them. There's not enough for everyone to drive, then how can everyone drive one? So why should people do a thing that is not possible? That becomes a solvency argument, and solvency is a separate issue. But what most people will do is then try to explain why, no, it's possible for everyone to drive one, and here's why. Like, our plan entails that, or we think that if enough people start driving them, people are going to make more, and they'll naturally, like, as long as there's demand, the market will meet it or whatever. But really what you're trying to do is get them to say in their own words, we're going to make lots of new cars. And that was the second premise in contention 3, which we said is probably the hardest one to prove, right? Now you have that going for you. You say they say that they're going to make lots more, and all I need to prove is that that would do a bunch of environmental damage. Here's one last good question for this hypothetical scenario that I think is a really good one. Works in a similar way, but a little bit different. And you can even ask in conjunction, right? You can ask this question next. You would ask, why is not hurting the environment the most important impact in this debate? Why should it be the most important impact? Now, your opponent has the opportunity, they have the options to say, well, it's not. Probably aren't going to do that, right? Especially if that's something they've already made one of their contentions, right? If you ask them why is that super important, they'll most likely take the bait and start talking on and on about why the environment is so important, why it's the most important impact that we're going to talk about in the round, why it's more important than the economy. And this is because what they think you're signaling is that you're going to make an outweigh argument, right? That you're going to say my economy argument or whatever is more important. So they will just try to bolster this impact to be the biggest impact in the round. And instead what you do is you read an argument that turns their environment impact against them, right? You say, well, you have said that the status quo, you have said that the environment's the most important thing, and I have now proven that you will hurt the environment, which is the only thing that should matter in the debate. So you essentially have a really, really easy path to winning the round, because you've used this question to turn winning one argument to winning the whole round, because you get them to say that this is the most important impact and where the judge should vote first. So let's sort of recap all of that. Ask questions that force your opponent to give an answer that benefits your arguments. And usually the way you do that is get them to agree with one of the premises that you're going to use later without them knowing it. And oftentimes in a debate, arguments on both sides will share a premise, like whether an impact is important or some aspect of the status quo that you can get them to say in their own words so that they can't take it back later as an attempt to refute your argument. If one of your arguments shares an impact with theirs, which we just talked about, force them to double down on that impact. Now, this only really works if you're confident in that turn, in how good that turn argument is. Because if you're not going to win the turn, you're not going to win the impact, you're not helping yourself outweigh the argument later by giving them a platform to make it the most important impact. But if you are confident in your ability to turn it, this is great because it takes it from winning one argument to winning the whole round. Lastly, don't let your opponent know what you're going to be arguing, if you can help it at all, right? Just don't let them just get up there and take your invitation to read front lines to your arguments before you even get a chance to make them. Okay, here's where we're going to talk about how to make your opponents look bad. Earlier version of this, I had it say make your opponents look dumb. I decided I didn't like the phrasing of that, but there it is. I guess I forgot to change it. What I'm worried about is that young people are going to watch this and they're going to interpret what I'm saying as go in there and be an asshole and try to ridicule your opponents, which is 1,000% not what I am saying. And so the first point I have to make here is that this doesn't benefit you if it makes you look bad. Trying to ridicule your opponents, if it's perceived that way, will not make you look good. And when I say it makes you look bad, that could mean like it makes you look like a bad person, but it could also make it look like you're bad at asking questions. You can make it look like you're bad at understanding the background or the research at this topic, because if you try to do it and you're at all wrong about how you understood the scenario, you're basically going to hurt your credibility irredeemably. And we will look at an example of that later. It should be their words that make them look bad or dumb or whatever, right? They should say something. It shouldn't be like, I said this. You should ask them a question that has them say something that the judge is going to have a negative perception of. And the way you do that is you ask them a question that ought to be very simple, that the judge or the audience or whoever is listening to and is not thinking, this is a very difficult question to answer. How complex? It should be something that is relatively simple, but you understand, based on your understanding of their advocacy, that they have to answer this question in a certain way. Like it just has a logical conclusion. So their options are abandon their advocacy or admit this thing that logically concludes from their advocacy that is going to make them look bad. And of course, these are things that you would mention in your own speech, but here is the opportunity for you to get them to say it in their own words, which is a great way of using cross-ex time. Probably the most effective, since cross-ex is so much about perception of who's winning, and that perception of who's winning wins you rounds so often. So here's some examples. I was going to look up videos of competitors in high school LD rounds and public forum rounds, but in order to post those, I would have liked to ask for their permission, and this video already took long enough to make. So I'm just going to give you some examples from rounds that I remember from when I was a competitor in college, some good questions that I think I asked that demonstrate some of these points. I'm not trying to toot my own horn here or anything. I was not that good a debater. But let's go to the first one, which was the affirmative. It was a debate about indigenous populations, and the affirmative early on, sort of like in the topic case, was saying that 5% of the world is considered indigenous. I wrote that down, didn't really think about it, and then later they said this argument about India, and their link, they're basically explaining how it's on topic, was to say that India's population counts as indigenous. Now, this is a contradiction, and I could have, in my next speech, said, my opponent contradicts herself, and in fact, I think I did say that, but the way I could phrase the question is, isn't that a contradiction? Which invites my opponent to clarify as the first step. But instead, what I asked was, what is the population of India? And they say 1 billion. And then I said, well, if 5% is indigenous, how is 1 billion 5% of 7 billion? Right? And then they're behind the 8 ball, because it doesn't look like they just had two incongruous definitions or whatever. It looks like they're bad at math, right? Which then they have to explain what the definitions, and in this case, we had a panel of, it was a relatively, for the time, high-level round, but the entire panel was interp judges who aren't dumb by any means, but they're more persuaded by things like this than by techie arguments and following whatever. Like, when they see someone struggle to answer what seems like a basic question, they tend to be really persuaded to vote for the person asking the question. Here's example 2. This was another round at a tournament I was at. This round and the previous round were at the state championship for community colleges. Last one was Parley LD, which used to be an event that doesn't exist anymore. This one was just regular Parley and PDA. This tournament just has weird topics. So this topic was miracles exist. I was the negative, and the affirmative, who went on to be a great debater, who I respect, in this debate was making an argument that just didn't really make any sense. And that was the infinite monkey theorem. They were saying that the infinite monkey theorem states that if you get an infinite number of monkeys in a room with typewriters and they just type gibberish till the end of time, eventually you're guaranteed to reproduce the entire works of Shakespeare word by word, letter by letter, punctuation by punctuation. And isn't that fantastic? Isn't that unlikely? That's incredibly unlikely, sort of like a miracle. The main line of argumentation that I had against this in my refutation was that miracle doesn't mean unlikely, it means impossible, or whatever, right? But I took the opportunity in cross-ex to make my opponent look a lot worse than just clarifying this, and I asked, do infinite monkeys exist? Right? Because obviously even if his entire argument was true and the infinite monkeys are a miracle, if they don't exist, then that's not evidence that miracles do, right? And that it seems like a very simple question, but it points out a logical flaw that your opponent has, that they now have to double back on and try to explain in some complex, haphazard, sort of panicked way. Okay, third example. This was from a practice round against a middle schooler that I did on a public forum topic, so I'm least of all bragging about this one. But I think it's worth pointing out, and it demonstrates a lot of what we've been talking about. Because this, in and of itself, this argument isn't bad. So let's take a look at it. The affirmative was saying that, I actually don't remember if he was affirmative or negative. I don't remember the resolution. But my opponent was saying that UNCLOS funds small nations, which is true. And then he said that small nations are disproportionately likely to fund terror groups, or smaller, developing, or whatever. And this statement is also true. And then the next card was an example of a small nation that funds terror organizations, and the example that he used was Afghanistan. And this also is true. Afghanistan has done that stuff. But here is the question I ask. What sea is Afghanistan bordering? Because UNCLOS is a sea treaty, and as you can tell from this map, Afghanistan isn't on the sea, meaning they don't receive UNCLOS funding. Now, Afghanistan was just his example, right? If he had said Somalia, the argument would have worked just fine. And in fact, if I had waited for my next speech to bring this up, my opponent would, if they were decent at debate, have several minutes and maybe prep time to gather their thoughts and be like, yeah, okay, sure, Afghanistan great point, but that was just to demonstrate our argument that small nations do this stuff. But Somalia is a better example. It still funds like Afghanistan, but it would get funding from UNCLOS and so on, right? But instead, what I ask is, what sea is Afghanistan bordering? Which puts them in their head trying to imagine a map, first of all, and they're like, well, what are their options? To try to throw out a guess, try to say, I don't know. Neither of those are going to benefit them very much. Or just off the bat be like on the spot trying to explain, well, they're not bordering a sea, and then maybe they realize why I brought it up. Or maybe they don't. They'll say it's not bordering a sea. It's like, what does this have to do with UNCLOS then? Why would they get the funding? Or they'll be like, well, it doesn't border the sea and it doesn't whatever, but it was just an example. It really gets in your opponent's head. And for a judge, they might find this funny. They might then be like, well, this debate is over. I'm voting for the other guy. So very effective way of asking the question. Now, for the rest of this, I had some videos that are really like outside of an academic debate context, where I think some of these principles that we've talked about are being applied well or being applied poorly. So the first one I want to talk about is when I said that trying to make your opponent look bad doesn't work if it just makes you look unconfident, hurts your credibility. And there's actually another postulate. Is that too grand? We're gonna throw that out. Another postulate for effective question asking that is worth talking about here. So let's.
Why is it that a bill banning abortions after a woman has been pregnant for 6 weeks is not a return to the Dark Ages? What's your answer?
My answer is something called science. Human life exists at conception. It ought to be protected. Now back to my.
Great. So that's not actually the part of the video in question. It was a good open-ended question. I think the answer is decent. Like, whether you agree with it or not, right? Like, the answer in itself didn't hurt this guy's advocacy very much. What we're here to actually talk about is the rest of this video. So he decides that he's going to flip the tables on the interviewer because he didn't like the question. So he's like, here's my question. And the first thing you'll notice about this is that it's in no way a question. It's just a criticism of the interviewer. It's refutation, right? Which we talked about early on. Cross-X is not refutation. But he does what a lot of debaters I see do, even the more experienced ones, which is where they'll basically just make a refutation and then they'll pause, and he does too, you'll see a look on his face, realize he said it would be a question and it's not, and then just sort of quickly throw on a question at the very end. That's the first problem. The second problem is, in an attempt to be aggressive, there was something that he didn't consider, and now his credibility is much more damaged than if he hadn't attempted to do this. Let's take a look.
My question to you. You purport to be an objective journalist. BBC purports to be an objective down-the-middle network. It obviously is not. It never has been. And you as a journalist are proceeding to call one side of the political aisle ignorant, barbaric, and sending us back to the Dark Ages. Why don't you just say that you're on the left?
So you saw there, right? He was just making an argument. He's not asking his opponent a question that makes his opponent say the BBC is not nonpartisan. It's clearly on the left. He says, obviously you're not, and so on. Pauses, doesn't know what to say, and then he's like, so why don't you just admit that that is true? And in this case, that backfires because the person he's asking is a well-known conservative journalist in the UK, and this is the response that he gets.
Is this so hard for you? Why can't you just be honest?
Mr.
Seriously,
Shapiro,
it's a serious question.
Mr. Shapiro, if you only knew how ridiculous that statement is, you wouldn't have said it. So let's move on. Would you vote
I
for Mr.
think it's pretty evident from your own questions exactly what you are, sir.
Trump?
And here's the thing. Anyone watching that on the BBC in the UK would probably know who that person is. And even if their values are more aligned with Ben Shapiro than, I guess his name is Studio, they're likely to go like, oof, that was a rough one. That they're not likely to come out of this being like, got him, another one down, Ben. Okay, let's look at another one. Actually, right. So this was going to be an example where it was from a real public forum round that I've only seen the cross-ex of, and I'm told that the person who asked the question has since said he was sorry and whatever. So I didn't want to put the video in as an example. But basically what happens is something that certainly isn't unique to that round, where the person asking the question makes a comparison, like draws a comparison, like your argument is just like this, so why do you not believe that? And that is almost never convincing, and in this case it just makes the debater look like an asshole, and apparently there was some backlash and didn't make the debater look good, right? And the takeaway message is, if you're trying to draw a comparison, your cross-ex should be attempting to make your opponent admit that comparison. Have it be in their words instead of you being like, here's this comparison, agree or disagree, right? Like, imagine if you asked someone a question and they're like, oh, it's because we're modeling this just after how the Nazis did something. Probably going to lose the debate very quickly. But if you ask the question like, isn't this how the Nazis did it? Like, I don't think that that's going to get you very far, and it's just going to make you look like a dick. But here is a different video of a dog relaxing, because I didn't want to have no video. That was very nice. Okay, our third example is a good example of asking a question that sounds very simple but forces your opponent to admit something you know it'll force them to admit that will draw a reaction out of your audience. Instead of you saying, this is what my opponent believes, if you think that they have to say that as a natural function of their beliefs, and you think them saying it out loud in their own words will get a certain reaction, then it's more effective to make them say it. This is a debate between a guy named Christopher Hitchens and a guy named Frank Turek.
Final question.
Is it not the case that the spread of Christianity, about which you spoke so warmly and affectingly in your opening remarks, attributing it to the innate truth of the Bible story, was spread by that means, or because the Emperor Constantine decided to make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire? Which, in your view, contributed more to the spread of the faith?
So the question is, based on what Frank Turek said earlier in the debate, Christopher Hitchens wants to make the point that I don't think Christianity spread because of, at least as quickly because of its inherent benefits. It probably spread most quickly because the largest empire at that time on the planet made it the law that you must follow this religion. But he poses the question in a way, because Frank Turek's options are now to say, yeah, that's a good point, Christopher. Maybe it wasn't just the inherent values of it. Or he will say that the cause of it was
the Holy Spirit.
I rest my case.
Thank you.
And so at this point, Christopher Hitchens knows what the audience will think of that and what reaction that'll get, and so he makes a punchline out of it. And you can see in this, the reason this is particularly painful to watch is you can see there's people in the audience who are probably on Frank Turek's side and probably also, I don't know, it's just hard for them to hear that because he's making an argument that seems even to them to be unconvincing, right? You can see people like bowing their heads down. Okay. All right, one last bit on answering questions. Just to wrap everything up. Answering questions almost never benefits you. We talked about this earlier, right? And now this should possibly be hopefully be in greater context, right? Because if good people are asking you questions, it's probably because they're trying to accomplish all of those things that we just talked about. And you don't want to do all that work for them. So here's a couple things to keep in mind when you're answering questions. Always answer yes or no questions with a yes or a no. So just punish them for asking a weak question. Well, the way you do this is you take 1 second and you just decide which answer is more in line with my advocacy, yes or no. They ask you the question and you just say yes, or you say no. They say nothing else. And then they either have to move on, or more likely they'll be forced to ask a better question, or they'll ask you to elaborate. And that just sort of puts you more in control of the discussion happening, but also it keeps you in the mental habit of not wasting more time than you need to. Now, of course, sometimes binary questions are false dichotomies, and if that's the case, you just want to say that the premise of the question is false. But the main point here is give the shortest answer that suffices. And whenever possible, answer a question with what you've already said, meaning refer back to something you already said in your case and talk about it as though it answers the question they're asking you now. That does a few good things. The first is that it makes it look like you are ahead on this issue and they're behind, right? Like, I already answered this in my case, right? So that makes it look like they either failed to keep up because they didn't understand something, and if the judge feels like they understood it and the competitor didn't understand it, that makes the competitor look bad, or just makes it look like they weren't paying attention or whatever, right? It also gives you a chance to elaborate more on your points. What you really want is to get to expand on what you've already said. So take whatever opportunities you get, right? Like, if you think you can make it convincingly sound like you're answering the question, take that opportunity to just bolster your earlier points. Give more examples, give more links. Be like, well, here's a few more examples of why my argument is true. Now they have more to refute later. Or elaborate on your impacts. And this is important because you always have to stand firmly by your advocacy, meaning you shouldn't change your mind about something you've already said in a question. So at that point, in for a penny, in for a pound. Just go all in on something you've already said, because you're not giving your opponent new ammo. You're just doubling down on what you've already said, which you should be willing to stand by regardless. And it's really easy to get in the heads of inexperienced debaters in cross-ex by, say they come up and they make an argument that is good, that says we should let people who are in prison for nonviolent drug offenses out. And you ask them the question, so do you think we should let all people who are in prison for nonviolent drug offenses out? And 9 times out of 10, they will say, well, it's complex, or, well, maybe not all of them, or they'll start like backpedaling and putting all of these asterisks on their argument because they're really like intimidated by or scared of like what argument you're about to make in your next speech, so they're doing everything they can to try to not link into it. But the fact of the matter is you already linked into it the moment you made your argument, so just stand by it. Every asterisk you're putting on now becomes a reason for the judge to not vote on your argument, right? I can just come up and say, look, they're not even sure about their argument. They're not even sure if they do take all these people out of prison. Here's what we talk about instead. So don't be a coward. You've already made the argument. Commit to it when you're in cross-ex. Okay, we're done with this video. I just want to take a second to thank you guys for watching, but also thank the people who've been contributing to this channel as an audience so far. We can't see who the subscribers are by name. Sometimes we get like notifications that says someone subscribed, or you comment or something. I have a couple names here. I'd like to say them out loud. Hopefully you wouldn't mind. But I want to thank Dick Fred, who subscribed earlier today. Hey, I don't know if you're ever going to see this. D. Costello, Raquel Carvalho, Samyuk Nepal. Hopefully I'm saying these names right. I think I'm doing an alright job for a guy named Sasan Kesravi. Amity Supreme, Isaac Liu, Jimothy the Unicorn. Definitely want to make sure I got that one right. Jasper Data, Thaddeus Smith, Kyle Brenner, and of course, How could I not thank our first subscriber on the channel, Ben Dover? Ben, you know, none of this would have been possible without you, Ben, so definitely a shout out to Ben Dover. So we do want to hear from you guys. Any questions you may have, obviously, about this topic or any other topics we'd like to hear. But also, you know, what other topics do you think we should cover? What's working? What isn't? What would your ideal channel for debate information look like? What would it include? And we also want to know if you guys are interested in direct online coaching, like through Skype or through whatever the kids use nowadays. This was always a part of what we planned for Proteus Debate Academy to offer. We've just been trying to figure out the logistics of what form that would take, and that is, you know, taking a bunch of work, but it would be nice to know whether people would even be interested, because if no one's interested, then maybe we'll just save ourselves the work of trying to figure out the logistics of how to do it. So I'm Sasan Kasravi with Proteus Debate Academy. Hopefully you like this video. Hopefully you like what we've put out so far. There's gonna be a lot more on the way.